Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Wednesday, 30th of January, 2019. And as you can see, I'm on the edge of the East Lancashire moors here and had quite a smattering of snow last night, as I believe did much of the country. Pendle Hill behind me, invisible this morning, covered in clouds that look as though they're full of snow. Well, hopefully, I'm going to be able to get back down the motorway later today, and I shall be in the studio in Plymouth tomorrow night for another episode of Humanity versus Insanity. And, where do I start? There's so much going on right now. Well, the title of this morning's broadcast is the EU and Brexit, the final countdown, question mark. 2 months from today, on the 30th of March, that should be the first day in which the UK is free of the EU shackles since the European Communities Act was passed by British Parliament, by a treasonous British Parliament back in 1972, because there were many, and it is now very well documented, there were many, including Ted Heath, who knew very well that signing the European Communities Act into law would effectively remove sovereignty from British Parliament and effectively bring the UK under the guise of the European legislature, and effectively over a period of some 50 years or so, finally remove the UK as a nation state. And of course, this is precisely what is scheduled to occur in 2022. So it would be exactly 50 years since the European Communities Act was signed into British law. And in 2022, as per the Treaty of Lisbon, all nation states would cease to exist within the EU, and effectively their national parliaments would be nothing more than just a local council, which is pretty much what they are right now. So we'll come back to the EU because I do just want to spend a bit of time taking a look at what's happening in Venezuela, because of course the vast majority of people have no real idea what's occurring in Venezuela. It's not on their radar, and neither should it be necessarily. But since Chavez passed away, then it's become very clear that the US corporatocracy would very much like to establish a puppet government, because the US would like to be able to establish full control over the Venezuelan oil reserves. And Venezuela, arguably, has the largest oil reserves on the planet. Yes, larger than Saudi Arabia and larger than Iran, much of which is not yet exploited. But of course, the largest producing area in Venezuela is Lake Maracaibo. And, woe betide the Venezuelans if they think that they have a divine right to control that national resource. It's the divine right, of course, of the corporatocracy, which is currently being driven very much by John Bolton. And whilst I don't believe for one moment that Trump actually buys in to all of Bolton's bullshit, he's keeping Bolton as close as he possibly can. But Bolton does certainly seem to be a bit of a loose cannon here regarding Venezuela. So what's occurring here in Venezuela? Well, President Nicolas Maduro. Now, let's just put a few things in perspective, because in the elections last year, he polled 67.8% of the vote. 6.245 million people voted him into office, and the closest contender actually got just 20% of the vote. And all of the independent observing bodies who were reviewing and monitoring the election process in Venezuela declared them to be free and fair elections. But of course, having a left-wing president, another left-wing president in Venezuela, doesn't sit well with the global corporatists. So they've decided, well, Bolton, I think, is the prime mover here. John Bolton has decided that they will initiate a move by a big chunk of the developed world to put pressure on Venezuela by declaring Guaido as the interim president, who's the head of the National Assembly and hasn't won any elections whatsoever. But obviously now, because it's a government that the corporatists don't want, then they're going to look to bring popular pressure from all around the world. And, when I see the intellectual imbecile Jeremy Hunt also articulating as though he actually knows what he's talking about, which of course he doesn't any more than he did when he was trying to destroy the NHS. Well, quite successfully actually. But nonetheless, I mean, for him to pontificate on what's occurring in Venezuela is completely outrageous. But Bolton says that the objective here is to restore democracy in Venezuela. Now, any time anyone in the US administration starts talking about restoring democracy, then you know that this is a prelude to yet another probable military attack, or if not a direct attack, then the funding of one by proxy forces. Yet there's no question that Maduro is much more of a legitimate president of Venezuela than Bush ever was after the election of 2002, when, of course, he was famously awarded the US presidency following the Supreme Court reviewing the result in Florida, where, of course, his brother was the governor at the time, and it was the Florida result that finally determined that Bush, rather than Al Gore, should be the president. Yet we didn't see the rest of the world declaring Gore as the legitimate president. They accepted the situation in the US, and it was up to the residents and citizens of the US to do something about it if they were so minded. So it was 2000, wasn't it, that election? It was 2000, and Bush was sworn in on the White House lawn in January 15th, 2001. It's all flooding back now. Anyway, so here is the distraction, and watch the media as Theresa May and her negotiators all try to deflect attention away from their incompetence by trying to get people to focus on what's occurring in Venezuela. And, actually, you know what? Maduro should actually announce that he recognizes, say, Jeremy Corbyn as the legitimate Prime Minister of the UK, because he has no confidence in Theresa May. Well, of course, he won't be alone there, because neither does a significant chunk of this country. And so here we are, 2 months away from the date when which we should be free of EU hegemony. And yet, of course, Theresa May was put into that job to deliberately screw it up. And I don't think anyone can argue she's done an absolutely brilliant job of screwing up the exit negotiations from the EU. So now, with just 2 months to go, Parliament, because it has no experience whatsoever of negotiation, tries to hamstring further negotiations by trying to take the no deal exit off the table. Well, there was a vote in favour of removing no deal as an option, but I understand that it's non-binding. It is simply an advisory. So, let's not hang too much on that. So, what's going to happen here? Well, who knows? It's anyone's call. But, of course, the French are going to be using, particularly Macron is going to be using the Brexit chaos to try and deflect attention from what's going on in his own country. And of course, Macron also has the audacity to join the Bolton call to reject Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, when Macron's own popularity rate is now wallowing somewhere around about 28% and falling. So, we live in some very, very interesting times. And if anyone's ever taken the time out to go visit with their MP or had the opportunity to quiz other MPs, it's remarkable how often they use the excuse of, well, we can't do that because it's legislated by Brussels. And of course, if you're in Scotland, then they have the double benefit of saying, well, we can't do that because it's legislated by Brussels, or actually that's controlled by Westminster. Well, Brexit, of course, puts the onus, sliding here on snow, puts the onus right back where it should be, which is at Westminster. And from the point of Brexit forward, British MPs will no longer have the opportunity to say, well, we can't be actually taking too much notice of this, or can't be having too much of an input because it's all determined by Brussels. So for the last 47 years, British parliamentarians have had a really easy ride. It's money for old rope. All they do is rock up in Parliament once or twice a week, maybe, certainly for PMQs, because that's when they know the cameras are going to be potentially on them. And then maybe, they draw the short straw and have to turn up for the odd debate just to make it look like the British Parliament is actually has any kind of meaningful role, when it doesn't. The legislation rolls down from the lobbyists through the European Commission. The European Parliament is simply an advisory body, has no real input whatsoever on EU legislation, rolls downhill, rubber stamped into the British statute books by civil servants. And as I've said before, there's not enough of those civil servants. So in fact, only about 20% of EU legislation has actually managed to find its way onto the statute books, because there hasn't been enough rubber stamps to go round. So, for those who still hang on to the belief that remaining within the EU is in any way, shape or form beneficial, all one can ask is, get your heads out of the sand. And over the last few weeks, I've been sort of quite inflammatory by making the observation that I've yet to meet anyone who wants to remain in the EU who can actually describe how the EU legislative process works, what the relationship is between the EU Commission and the EU Parliament. And certainly they have absolutely no idea of the Coudenhove-Kalergi agenda, which, by the way, Saeed Javed has absolutely signed up to. He's desperate to get the Coudenhove-Kalergi award, it would seem, before Britain finally does get out of the EU. And of course, the Coudenhove-Kalergi award is given to the EU politician who is perceived to have done the most to promote unfettered migration, the purpose of which, as clearly spelled out by Coudenhove-Kalergi back in his 1920s book, Pan-Europa, the primary objective is to undermine the European nation state and to destroy their culture through mass migration. And Saeed Javed has said, well, even, we get out of the EU, there'll be unfettered migration till 2022. So, it's another case of Blair and Mandelson just seeing literally how many people they can squeeze into the country, and preferably under the radar. And of course, elsewhere, the British Council are recruiting in sub-Saharan Africa and telling the young African men that all they got to do is make their way to England, and there's a job waiting for them, there's a house waiting for them, and the streets of London are paved with gold until they get here. And then, of course, they find that it ain't quite like it was presented. So there has never, ever been a more important time for people to participate in the political process in this country in some way, shape or form. Now, I know that having made that statement, 90% of the population of the country won't get involved. not until such time as it's right up close and personal on their doorstep and they can see for themselves how it's affecting them. Until such time as it affects them, they just want to bury their heads, say, no, 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 nothing to do with me, and just keep trucking along. Well, the good news is that there's up to 10% of people waiting to participate, wanting to participate, and actually just looking to find the right opportunity. And even at half that, even at 5% of the population, the establishment knows fine well that they do not have the resources within the media or government to counter 5% of the population participating in the process. Because, of course, the whole way in which the British political system works is they want your vote and then they want you to disappear and just leave them to milking whatever they can out of their role as MP. You know, get the snouts as deep in the trough as possible, and of course the deeper the snouts in the trough, the easier they are to manipulate. Well, the bottom line now is that, you know, it's really, really important to start thinking about who you are putting into Parliament. And I know all the people who say, well, don't vote, don't give them legitimacy. Well, let me just tell you that the Tories love hearing that, because the Tories know fine well that anyone who elects not to vote would be unlikely to vote for the Tories anyway. So that's another opposition vote that isn't going to get counted because the person's not going to vote. So, you know, I'm simply pointing out the fact that it doesn't matter whether 80% of the people don't vote, unless they are prepared to do something about it, as they are in France. Then basically the Tories would just say, thank you very much for not voting, and thank you for those who did, because we now have an absolute majority. So, you know, it may not be what people want to hear, but the next few months are going to be absolutely critical in determining the future that unfolds for the residents and citizens of the UK. And failure to participate in the process right now runs the risk of you know, a similar situation to that which has occurred in so many other places in the EU over the last 47 years. I mean, if I told you, for example, that I think there's been 40 something referenda in the EU, around the EU, since 1972. And, you know, the most extreme of those were, you know, the results on the EU constitution, when France and the Netherlands had to vote on whether or not the EU constitution should be accepted. And in both cases, the electorate firmly rejected the EU constitution as having any superiority over their national constitution. But in both cases, the governments of France and the Netherlands basically said, well, thanks for letting us know what you think, but we don't really care because we're going to embrace it anyway. Well, finally, the French have decided that enough is enough. And, you know, they have seen the writing on the wall. They know that their nation, of which they are rightly very proud of, their culture, which they are rightly very proud of, is under massive threat. And it's the same in Germany, the same in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia. And, you know, so consequently, based on the current model, I can't see the EU existing except in some kind of totalitarian martial law format after the next decade or so, because the current trend is such that the people are saying enough is enough, and we need our country back, we need our self-determination back, and we need to get rid of the global corporatists. Now, just for those who are still with me this morning, I will be releasing the list of speakers at AV10 within the next 10 days or so. It is going to be a truly staggering list of speakers. with some overseas speakers who are going to share their unique insights. And I'm going to share one with you. I'm going to share one with you right now because the Danish politician Mads Polvig has agreed to speak. And, Mads is a former banker who has seen the light. And I'm not going to go into any explanation right now, but his party, which is called JFK 21, will be fielding candidates in the forthcoming Danish elections, probably at the end of May. And, Mads, having spent a considerable chunk of his life inside the belly of the beast, has had that Damascus moment and now sees the damage and the danger of rampant corporatocracy. And of course, he's been up close and personal. And so, Mads, I know, has some unique insights, which he's going to be sharing with us at AV10. So it's the last couple of days at which tickets are available at £165. They go to the full price, I'm told, of £175 on Saturday. Anyway, it's actually a beautiful morning up here. It's not, there's no wind. The air is very still. It actually feels quite dry. Yeah, got an audience in the next field here. And I think I might just take a gentle stroller across the moors before I head back, hopefully, to Devon later this afternoon. Meanwhile, you have a great day. Do dig a little bit deeper into what's going on in Venezuela. Don't take the media BS at face value. And, whatever it is that British politicians state about President Maduro and Venezuela, basically it is pure distraction, an attempt to get people to turn their head and look away whilst they continue to attempt to manipulate a means of keeping the UK in the EU. Well, I and an increasing number of people from all around the country need the British government and Parliament in general to understand that that ain't going to happen. And if you want, as politicians, to avoid a repeat in the UK of what's unfolding in France right now, then you need to follow the will of the people, increasingly so, and get the UK out of the EU by the due date of March 29th, 2019. You have a great day, and join me tomorrow evening at 7:30 on this YouTube channel and this Facebook channel for the next episode of Humanity versus Insanity. And if you miss that, then I will be back on Friday morning at 8:30. You have a great day.